Right now, tucked into a gland just above each of your eyes, your body is capable of producing a substance strong enough to change a stranger's biology without them knowing it happened. Not through anything they see, not through anything they can consciously smell. Researchers had men sniff vials of liquid with no detectable odor. Half the vials held saline. The other half held tears, collected from women watching sad movies. The men who breathed in the tears rated women's faces as less sexually attractive afterward. Their arousal dropped. So did their testosterone. In a follow-up study, simply breathing that same odorless liquid cut male aggression by close to half. Nobody had touched them. Nobody had spoken to them. A few drops of salt water had quietly changed how their bodies were behaving, and they never knew why. That should be one of the strangest findings in human biology. Instead, it's barely known, and here's what makes it stranger still. The man usually credited with explaining why our bodies do what they do looked directly at human crying and decided it did nothing at all. Charles Darwin spent his career finding a reason for nearly every trait in nature. When he got to emotional tears, he gave up. In his own words, weeping was purposeless, no more meaningful than a sneeze. He was wrong, proving exactly how wrong runs through hired mourners, self-inflicted tears, weeping nights, and a Japanese businessman who now sells strangers a good cry for a living. By the end of this, just crying is going to look like one of the most engineered behaviors your body has. Start with the basics, because even these are stranger than they sound. Your eyes are making tears all day long, whether you're upset or not. A thin film that keeps them from drying out. A second kind floods out the moment something irritates you, smoke or a sliced onion. Then there's a third kind, triggered purely by feeling something, and it's oddly late to show up. Newborns cry from the moment they're born, loudly, but with dry eyes. Most babies don't produce visible tears until somewhere between 2 weeks and 3 months old, once their tear glands finally catch up. The sound of distress comes first. The tears get added afterward, almost like a separate feature bolted on later. That gap matters because as far as anyone can tell, humans are the only species with that second feature at all. Plenty of animals cry out when they're hurt. Plenty produce basic tears to protect their eyes. But shedding tears specifically because of an emotion has never been confirmed in any other species. Not chimpanzees. Not dogs. Elephants get viral videos and no solid evidence. We even convinced ourselves, for a few centuries, that a reptile beat us to it. A 14th century travel book claimed crocodiles wept while devouring their prey, out of a kind of twisted remorse. Crocodiles do tear up while eating, for plumbing reasons, not emotional ones. But the fabricated version stuck so hard that Shakespeare was still using it 200 years later, and we still are, every time we call someone's tears crocodile tears. So if this really is a uniquely human add-on and it arrives separately from the cry itself, what's it actually doing? The leading answer for decades has been signaling. A crying person is broadcasting something a shout can't. Visible, hard to fake vulnerability. Studies have found that people rate someone with visible tears as more likable and more deserving of help than the exact same person with a dry, neutral face. It functions like a white flag. In a conflict between two people, tears can end the fight before either side says a word. That theory leads straight back to the opening study. If tears are a signal, it makes sense they'd carry a chemical layer too. Something that works even through a stuffy nose, even in the dark. The tear sample that dropped men's testosterone and cut their aggression wasn't a fluke discovery. It matched what scientists already knew about mice, where a compound in tears makes other animals treat the crier as less of a threat and less of a mate. Humans appear to be running an old mammalian trick, leaking a chemical that quietly tells everyone nearby to stand down. There used to be a competing explanation, and it's worth knowing because people still repeat it as fact. In the 1980s, a biochemist named William Frey found that emotional tears carry higher levels of stress hormones than onion tears do, including a natural painkiller called leucine enkephalin. That led to the popular idea that crying detoxes you, physically flushing stress chemicals out of your body. It's a satisfying story. It's also probably not the real explanation. Critics have pointed out for years that the actual volume of hormone leaving your body through tears is far too small to change anything internally. If crying makes you feel better, and it usually does, the more likely explanation is slower breathing, a calming shift in your nervous system, and another person's response, not a hormonal drain. Which is where the story stops being about biology and starts being about what humans have done with this signal once they realized other people respond to it. For most of recorded history, that signal was not something men were expected to hide. Achilles weeps openly in the Iliad. Kings weep throughout the Bible. In medieval romance, the knight Lancelot bursts into tears simply because he's briefly separated from the woman he loves, and the story doesn't treat it as shameful. Nobody invents an excuse for his wet eyes. Crying read as depth, not weakness, across most of Europe. Scandinavia was the sharp exception. In medieval Iceland, accusing a man of having cried was such a serious insult that avenging it by killing the accuser was considered legally justified. Nearly everywhere else on the continent, tears were closer to a badge of honor. Religious life pushed the signal even further. Christian writers described weeping as a spiritual gift, visible proof that your devotion was genuine. Some 13th century religious women who couldn't cry on command reportedly used a caustic substance near their eyes just to force the tears out, because showing up dry-eyed to prayer looked like a lack of faith. People were manufacturing the exact biological signal that can chemically calm another person down, centuries before anyone understood why it worked. So where did "real men don't cry" actually come from, if it wasn't always true? Largely from the same man who dismissed tears as purposeless in the first place. In that same book, Darwin ranked cultures by how freely they cried, placing restrained Englishmen at the top of a civilized hierarchy and describing other peoples as weeping over trivial things, as if tears marked a person as less evolved. That idea landed in Victorian Britain right as the empire was consolidating a narrow new model of manhood, and within a couple of generations, a policeman who cried while testifying in court could become a national joke in the newspapers. The dry-eyed, stoic man wasn't an ancient default. He was a 19th century invention, tangled up with race and class, dressed up as biology. There is a real biological thread buried in the culture, though. Adult women have prolactin levels roughly 60% higher than adult men on average, and prolactin is linked to crying frequency. Before puberty, boys and girls cry at similar rates. The gap opens up afterward. Surveys across dozens of countries consistently find women crying several times more often than men, somewhere around 30 to 60 times a year for women, against roughly 6 to 17 times a year for men. So the hormones are real. They've just been wrapped in a much newer, much more rigid cultural rule about who's allowed to use the signal at all. And once you understand crying as a signal, something else becomes obvious. For thousands of years, people have been willing to pay for it. In ancient Egypt, families hired professional mourners, women, specifically required to be childless, to wail and tear at their hair for people they had never met. Rome had the same trade under a different name, and the more wailers a family could afford, the wealthier they looked to the whole street. Some funerals eventually banned the practice outright because hired mourners would scratch their own faces bloody trying to outdo each other. Victorian England hired mutes instead, men paid to stand silently grim-faced at the front of a funeral procession, sometimes compensated partly in alcohol. And more than one account describes mutes so drunk by the end of the walk that they had to be loaded into the hearse and driven home themselves. None of this was really about deception. It was a community needing the signal to be visibly present, even when the people closest to a loss were too shattered or too composed to produce it on their own. That instinct never disappeared, it just changed shape. In Tokyo today, a businessman named Hiroki Tarai runs group sessions where strangers gather to watch deliberately heartbreaking short films while a hired, photogenic young man moves through the room, dabbing away their tears with a handkerchief. He built the business after noticing that people in an emotionally reserved culture often couldn't cry at all without help. An Egyptian mourner tearing her hair 3,000 years ago and a Tokyo tear concierge wiping a stranger's cheek this year are separated by almost nothing that matters. They're solving the same problem. So go back to that opening study. The scentless vials, the men who never knew their bodies were reacting to anything, testosterone and aggression sliding downward in real time without a word being spoken. That's not a leftover twitch. That's not, as Darwin believed, a meaningless spasm of the facial muscles. It's a signal old enough and effective enough that humans have built religions around forcing it, economies around performing it, and, for a while, entire ideas of manhood around refusing to show it. The one thing crying has never actually been through any of that is pointless. Every time salt water spills down your face, some part of the world around you, chemically, socially, sometimes without either of you noticing it happening, is being quietly asked to be gentler with you. And more often than you'd expect, across every version of history anyone has bothered to write down, it works.